What's going on, everybody? So if you are a bit familiar with scenario planning or with futures and foresight in general, you might have heard that scenarios can be either explorative or normative. But what do those two terms even mean? Well, in this video I'll try to make some clarity about that, and I will also share with you a tool that I call the Control Compass that I've been using informally in my consulting work to determine whether an organization should do explorative scenarios or normative scenarios. So, what do explorative scenarios or normative scenarios even mean? Well, as it is often the case in futures and foresight, those two terms unfortunately have not been codified yet. So let me give you my interpretation of those two terms. And by the way, if you want to know how I arrived at that interpretation, you can just take a look at the attached Medium article to this video, which I linked in the description box down below. I believe that explorative scenarios are those scenarios that portray what can happen in the external environment outside of the organization where they are created, and that normative scenarios are scenarios that portray what should happen to the organization where they are created and to its external environment as a consequence of what will happen inside the organization. So, to be precise, normative are actually the strategies, policies, or choices of the organization in the scenarios rather than the scenario narratives themselves. But let me go on with the term normative scenarios for simplicity. So, from this you can easily see that these two types of scenarios have different assumptions. Explorative scenarios assume that the environment changes first in the future, and only as a consequence the organization will respond. So, according to explorative scenarios, the organization cannot change the future environment much. It can only prepare or respond to it. Normative scenarios, on the other hand, assume that the organization can and should change the future environment where it will operate actively. Okay, so bottom line, if explorative scenarios can help decision making in that they prescribe how the organization could perform well or prepare well in case the environment will move in certain directions, normative scenarios, on the other hand, help decision making in that they point to certain ways the organization could change the environment to its advantage or to the advantage of its customers or to the advantage of certain communities of interest, or all of the above. Okay, so now that we know what explorative scenarios and normative scenarios are, then how do we determine whether we should do the former or the latter? Well, it turns out it's never a either or affair. It's most times both. But then how do we decide whether we should lean on one side rather on the other? Well, let me explain how I personally make that decision. For me, the most crucial point when making that decision is to look at the most critical variable that determines whether we should do a relatively more explorative scenario planning project or a relatively more normative scenario planning project. And that critical variable is the control that the organization where we do scenario planning has or is likely to have on the external environment where it operates. And that is the environment that determines the geographical boundaries of the Futures and Foresight project. In other words, we need to look at the extent to which the organization can change its industry or political, policy, social environment, depending on the Futures and Foresight project, either now or later or both. This control will almost single-handedly determine whether we will do a relatively more explorative scenario planning project or a relatively more normative scenario planning project. Now, you might argue that there are other factors, and well, that is true, but in my experience, all those factors ultimately fall back on the level of control that the organization has or will have on the external environment. For example, you could say that we should look at the maturity of the organization, its resources, its industry, its key partners, its potential to grow, and so on. And yes, all those factors are crucial, but they are crucial in determining the level of control the organization has or will have in the future over the external environment. Resources, capabilities, partners, they all equal to zero unless they translate into ability to change and affect the environment. So, since the level of control is so important, I use it to determine whether we should do a relatively more explorative or normative scenario planning project. But let me explain how I do that in more detail.
Let's imagine that we can plot the level of control an organization has or can have in the future using an imaginary control compass. The level of control can vary from medium-high to medium-low. We don't consider very high levels of control or complete control, and this is because even the most established organization or most powerful government globally cannot have a complete control of the environment, otherwise it will be God. And we also don't consider levels of very low or inexistent control because even the smallest enterprise in and of itself has the potential to change the world. So, according to this imaginary control compass, we can distinguish between organizations with medium-high level of control over the external environment, which is often the case of governments or governmental institutions, organizations with medium-low level of control over the external environment, such as many small-medium enterprises, and organizations with medium level of control over the external environment in the middle, which is often the case of established global brands with a fair degree of control over their industry or economy now, or the case of startups with high potential to grow in the future. Now, determining at which of these three levels the organization where we do scenario planning stands will help us to decide whether we should do a relatively more normative scenario planning exercise or a relatively more explorative scenario planning exercise. If the organization has a medium-high level of control over the environment where it operates, we should probably do a mostly normative scenario planning. This means that most of the scenarios created will be normative. For example, portraying different ways the organization, in this case probably a government, may and should change the future. But it also means that a significant minority of the scenarios will be explorative, portraying what can happen in the political and diplomatic sphere outside of the control of that government, for example, to prepare to eventualities. If the organization has a medium-low control over the environment where it operates, we should probably do a primarily explorative scenario planning. This means that we will pay extra attention to what futures can happen and how to prepare for them. But it also means that a significant minority of the scenarios will portray futures that the organization can affect to its advantage, and that is normative scenarios, or better, scenarios which contain normative choices or strategies that the organization can implement. Just because we don't want to rule out the possibility to change that low control status quo. An organization with low control in the present could have the seeds in and of itself for high control in the future. And by the way, this is by far the most common situation we face in futures and foresight consulting. And that is why many of the videos I have already produced, such as the video on how to translate scenarios to strategy, actually focus on this kind of organization. Finally, if the organization has a medium control over the environment, we should probably do a half normative, half explorative scenario planning, giving equal weight to the futures the organization may and should create, and the futures outside of its control that it should prepare to. And of course, just because an organization with complete control or inexistent control over the environment does not exist, we also do not consider completely normative or completely explorative scenario planning exercises.
So I really hope that you liked this video, and I hope that it helped you to be more clear about what explorative scenarios and normative scenarios are, and to be more clear about whether we should do a relatively more explorative or normative scenario planning project. Now, do please take into account that what I've shown you here is a simplification of what happens in the reality of futures and foresight. In fact, the specific number of explorative scenarios or normative scenarios that we create in a scenario planning project is oftentimes not laid out at the beginning of the project, and it could just be determined along the way. For example, a certain normative scenario, or better, some normative strategies or policies that the organization should implement in the future, and the scenario that will originate from them could just pop up after some previously generated explorative scenarios are translated into strategy, as it is often the case. But anyhow, I still hope that this video helped you to, by and large, make that decision between relatively more explorative or relatively more normative scenario planning approaches. If you liked this video, I would super appreciate to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I will see you in the next video.